Hello, my name's Gavin and this is Genre Books, and I like to do deep dive investigations into Planet Stories. Rocket Summer allows me to dovetail this with the event, and although I'm a little bit late for the 1940s because that was last week, I hope no one will mind. So it's issue 6 of Planet Stories. This is spring 1941, I believe. And Planet Stories, this is not the issue. Unfortunately, I don't have a physical copy of what I want to talk about today, but this is generally what we're talking about. The 1940s sees the demise of the magazine size pulp. The 1940s is a challenging decade for the pulp industry. I think you could probably make an argument that all the decades are a challenging decade for the pulp industry. In the 1930s, we are dealing with the Great Depression. In the 50s, we are looking at the rise of paperbacks and the rise of television and all that competition for the entertainment spend of the intended audience. But from an industry perspective, the 1940s with World War II is, I think, probably the greatest challenge, existential challenge that it faced. By the end of the Second World War, there are only 8 science fiction and fantasy pulps remaining. You have astounding science fiction, startling stories, thrilling wonder stories, planet stories, weird tales, out of this world adventures, fantastic adventure, amazing stories, and famous fantastic mysteries. I think that's it. There are plenty of reasons for this. The privations of war, top of the list. There is a shortage of paper. So Unknown magazine has to close when the editor of Unknown magazine, John W. Campbell Jr., who also edits Astounding Science Fiction, essentially has to choose which one continues. Astounding Science Fiction, the following month after the closure of Unknown, moves to a digest format, which we'll be talking about later in Rocket Summer. All of the magazines, even the ones that survived the war, if there weren't quarterly publications, they go quarterly. As well as the physical paper, we start to lose personnel. Super Science Stories and Astonishing are pulps edited by Frederick Pohl, who in 1943 enlists. I've never seen a list of pulp writers who did actually sign up to fight in the war, or didn't survive the war. But I think it might, if such a list existed, prove sort of quite sobering reading. The pulp magazines are also facing sort of insurgent competition from the rise of comics. And whilst there is an argument that these pulp magazines offer still a fantastic escapist route, the times are definitely changing. There is less during the decade of the daring do of science fiction heroes in the Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers mode. One of the sartorial casualties of the 1940s is that our protagonists and antagonists no longer wear capes by the end of the decade, or very few of them do. The capes have moved over to be used by the superheroes. Science fiction is I hesitate to say growing up, but it certainly has a moment in one of the big events of World War II, which is the first use of atomic weapons. At this point, something which has been talked about as fiction, and atomic power talked about in its glowing terms about its uses. Suddenly we are confronted with its use as a weapon of war and the terrible destruction that it brings. This is at the same time a death knell for a certain way of talking about atomic power and atomic weapons, but it certainly does not stop people talking about atomic power. It's just the tenor of the conversation is very different from this moment on. We will probably see this in more minute detail looking at later issues of Planet Stories in the future, but as we're talking the 1940s as part of Rocket Summer, and as I am reading in weekly succession something from the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and next week the 1960s, it's been an instructive exercise to see the change in style quite so starkly. But this brings us back to the current issue that we're looking at of Planet Stories. This is spring 1941. This is still before the war, only if you're American, and readers can still enjoy some fairly frivolous escapist work like Ray Cummings, the War Nymphs of Venus. This is perhaps not Ray Cummings' finest hour, but he's always entertaining. This is the story of Kent Fanning and Jack Allen, who are on a fishing trip and are whisked away to Venus, where they help the Aryan civilization against the Gorts, who are fairly broad cardboard cutout villainous types. The Aryan civilization is annoyingly peaceful, but they do have a militant wing of war nymphs who are personified by, if not led by, Nereid, who befriends Kent Fanning and enlists his help. They are almost inevitably kidnapped, and whilst Kent resists the kidnappers, it looks like Jack Allen, his friend, might be trying to befriend them, and there's a little bit of intrigue there, and there's a big set piece battle scene at the end, and it's exciting. It's a fairly ludicrous scenario. I'm sure there is some kind of revisionist reading that can be made in light of the war that's to come, in that the Aryan civilization, who is looking to avoid conflict at all costs, is eventually drawn into one. Quite how far the Aryan and American nations are at that point, I think, is something maybe only Cummings could comment on, but certainly the more hawkish elements on the war nymph side are vindicated in the face of the onslaught of the Gorts. The next story is The Monster That Threatened the Universe by R.R. Winterbottom. This is an odd story. concerns a intergalactic beast called Limio, which looks like the size of a planet. It seems to be benign unless its territory is encroached upon. But its territory, because it gets encroached upon, continually expands, because once it's threatened, it will destroy and then take over more space. This brings it into conflict with the civilization of Earth. The civilization of Earth has changed quite dramatically from what anyone would recognise. I'll say there's no criminals, but there is no criminal behaviour. There is a compound that everybody takes which basically regulates behaviour. And only one man has braved sort of taking the antidote, and he is being classified as the first criminal that's been seen in Earth for years and years. His name is it's Marmaduke Cairns, I think, but Marmaduke. And what Marmaduke represents is not the criminal class. What he represents is cunning and ingenuity and creativity, all of which Winterbottom posits have been collateral damage in the drive to regulate the criminal behaviour out of the human race. But for the story, the upshot of this is that Marmaduke is the only person with the cunning and guile to confront Limio. Although this is recognised by one of the the space captains or space admirals who in fairness recognises his own shortcomings, realises they're not going to be able to best this creature that's sort of living in a black hole, and press gangs Marmaduke to come to Earth's aid. There is a slight contradiction in that the forces of Earth are only coming into conflict with Limio because of their drive for expansion and wanting to better themselves, which displays, a certain amount of creative thought. But if you can read that and square that circle, this is just an entertaining story, and it's one that shows that not all of these space conflicts in Planet stories are always resolved with the use of weapons. A couple of weeks ago, at the beginning of the Rocket Summer event, the name Neil R. Jones came up because he was one of the contributors, or one of the selected stories for Voices from the Radium Age, and he was also included in Isaac Asimov's Before the Golden Age, Volume 1. He's back in the 1940s with a short story called Vampire of the Void. This strange story deals with what can only be sort of termed an energy vampire in the form of Aeonis, who is helpfully a beautiful woman brought up in a secure location in Oklahoma, but liberated / captured when Earth is invaded. She is now in another secure location and uses her siren-like abilities to attract and destroy her captors. If that précis sounds a little confusing, that is quite an accurate description of the work. Whilst the figure of Aeonis is an interesting one, a good idea of this sort of energy vampire that can kill with a draining kiss, the frenetic activity that's going on between factions who we know very little about is a little haphazard. The next story is Treasure of Triton by Charles A. Baker. This is a short piece and involves a master criminal who has infiltrated some tight security to get to a particular planet. It's a planet where the inhabitants are in some kind of hibernation, but there is a very famous temple on the planet with an even more famous central jewel, and our protagonist is there to steal that jewel. This is one of those stories that has a punchline, which I won't give away. I find those stories can be a little bit hit and miss. This one, I think, probably gets to the mark. You can guess the outcome, but it's fairly amusing. The next story is The Cosmic Derelict by John Russell Fearn, and this tells a story of a starliner on a run from Jupiter to Earth that is caught in a space warp and is being dragged out of the galaxy at absolutely crazy speeds. They go past the speed of light and onwards, and they don't understand how the ship is actually surviving this. On board the ship there is it's a passenger liner, so we have our crew, we have rich passengers, sort of famous people from Earth, or the Earth of the future, bankers who think they can get out of the difficulties they're in by simply writing a check, and the actual owner of the liner who blames the captain for this absolutely unprecedented event. But the ending to this story is quite the turn, and the crew discover that the entire fabric of the universe is microcosms all the way down. I don't know if it's a story of size difference or a multiverse story or a mixture of the two, but I don't think I've heard of a universe set up in quite this way before. The science obviously is bunkum, but it's great fun. The next story has an utterly unmemorable title. It is called 4.5 B Eros by Malcolm Jameson, and it has a little bit of a frontier feel to it, but it's a story of contraband being unwittingly smuggled by pilots shuffling between planets. Someone is setting these pilots up. There is a court scene where a pilot has his ship and contents impounded, and he's thrown into prison to do hard labour in an area which will kill him within 6 months. His friend decides to investigate, and we follow him as he uncovers the scheme. The next story is Rocklynne, Exiles of the Desert Star, and we've seen a Rocklynne story in a previous issue of Planet Stories, who has the same protagonist. So this is Sid Hallemeyer, who works for a special Earth agency dealing with secret agency type stuff, and sort of cross between direct action and diplomatic action. And it's another space adventure where he has to go to a planet to perform some action, but one that is going to have serious consequences for a certain set of people who have been exiled there. I won't give away too much, but I quite enjoy Ross Rocklynne stories, and this one didn't disappoint. The next story, Satellite of Fear by Fred A. Kummer Jr., does disappoint a little bit, just in terms of the dismissive language used to the main female character who owns the ship that is in question. And the Comet is the name of the ship. It's on an asteroid which they're trying to extract some resource from, and they find that a couple of the crew members have died whilst en route to the area to get this. The rest of the crew go to investigate and find themselves caught in a trap, and the rest of the story is about how they outwit their captor, who is one of the crew members who has turned traitor and has been playing the long game to get them into this position. The final story in this issue is by Nelson S. Bond, and it is Revolt on Io, which deals with a revolt on Io. More specifically, it involves the travails of the crew and passengers of a ship which is en route to Io, which is carrying a consignment of weapons to help the forces, the authorities on the moon of Io against insurgent rebels. But there is a rebel presence on the ship, a aristocrat of Io who has had her titles stripped of her, is suspected of being the turncoat, but she and the third in command of the ship, Bud Chandler, are put in a position where they try to save the day. This being a pulp story from the 1940s, I don't think I'm giving too much away in spilling the beans that they do save the day, but Nelson S. Bond does this with his usual aplomb. I think he's one of the more superior writers of 30s, 40s science fiction in the short story format. He's just got a really nice way of describing stuff. I don't think it's too innovative in the description of the events, and the more I read, the more these ships do just seem like passenger liners in space. There is very strict hierarchy. There's always a little bit of a struggle between the chain of command on these ships, and usually someone who is working against the common good. And that's it for the 1940s for Rocket Summer. It's bittersweet. Grammaticus Books, in a post he made this week, also talking about 1950s pulp he was discussing, but viewing it in contrast to the late 30s pulp that he had discussed previously, and he says that the science fiction is better. I'm not saying that I disagree with him, but I would say that I'm more agreeing with myself. If you measure it by certain metrics, I think yes, there's that argument to be made. Things are more, after the 40s, scientifically rigorous. There is less outright villainy. the stories take themselves a bit more seriously. They become perhaps more philosophical. But I can't help but think that once our characters, heroes and villains, lose the capes and the ray guns and the daring escapes and the interplanetary swashbuckling, that we are losing something. We're losing a little bit of that fun, and it's a sad passing. In the 1950s there is an explosion of science fiction, and we'll see how popular it becomes, but I think there's something to mourn in the passing of big, bold, large magazine pulps to more sober, more self-conscious, no less inventive, but slightly more constrained digest formats. But for Rocket Summer, I'll be looking at this digest format in my next deep dive. And next month, I'll be returning to Planet Stories again with issue 7.